The crystal chandelier cast prismatic rainbows across the mahogany boardroom table as my wife Victoria stood to accept her golden trophy. Top salesperson of the year, the engraving read, catching the light like her carnivory smile. She clutched that cheap metal like it was the holy grail, her manicured fingers trembling with what the room probably mistook for humble gratitude. I knew better. Victoria trembled when she was about to draw blood. "Thank you all so much," she purred into the microphone, her voice carrying that practiced corporate sweetness that made my teeth ache. "This award means everything to me. It represents not just my hard work, but my dedication to carrying on the Sterling Industries legacy my father built." Polite applause rippled through the room. Board members in $1,000 suits nodded approvingly. The company's top brass smiled those hollow smiles that said they'd rather be anywhere else but trapped in another corporate circle idiot. Victoria's eyes found mine across the room. That smile sharpened to a razor's edge. Of course, I couldn't have done this without my husband David's support. She let the word hang in the air like a noose. "David, would you stand up? I know everyone's curious about what it feels like to watch your wife succeed while you do absolutely nothing productive with your life." The room erupted in laughter. Not the uncomfortable kind that might have saved my dignity, but genuine, belly-deep amusement. These sharks smelled weakness in the water, and Victoria had just chummed it with my humiliation. I stood slowly, feeling every eye in the room dissect me like a lab specimen. At 38, I wasn't much to look at. Average height, brown hair going gray at the temples, wearing a department store suit in a room full of Italian tailoring. The classic disappointment of a husband who'd married above his station. "Thank you, darling," I said, my voice steady despite the fire burning in my chest. "Always happy to support your ambitions." Victoria's smile faltered for just a microsecond. She knew that tone. We'd been married 8 years, and she'd learned to recognize when I was truly angry versus when I was just playing along with her games. This was different. This was the voice I used when I was about to burn everything down. "Well," she continued, trying to regain her momentum, "I suppose even the most ordinary people can contribute something to extraordinary success stories." More laughter, louder this time. Victoria's mother, Patricia Sterling, led the charge from her seat at the head table, her jewelry catching the light as she clapped with theatrical enthusiasm. She'd never liked me, never thought I was good enough for her precious daughter. Tonight, she was getting her money's worth of entertainment. I waited for the laughter to die down. Let them have their fun. Let them think they understood the joke. "You know what, Victoria?" I said, still standing, my hands clasped behind my back like I was giving a casual toast. "Since we're sharing amusing stories tonight, I've got one too. Want to hear it?" The room quieted. Victoria's knuckles went white around her trophy. "It's about a woman who thought she owned the world because Daddy gave her a corner office and a fancy title. She thought she could humiliate people without consequences. She thought she was untouchable because her last name was on the building." Victoria's face had gone pale, but she managed a brittle laugh. "David, maybe you should—" "The punchline," I continued, raising my voice just enough to cut through her interruption, "is that she never bothered to read the fine print on Daddy's will. See, when Harold Sterling adopted me 5 years ago, he transferred 77% of Sterling Industries into my name, which means, legally speaking, I own this company." The silence was so complete, I could hear the air conditioning humming. Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping on dry land. "And since I own the company," I said, pulling a folded document from my jacket pocket, "I'm exercising my right as majority shareholder to terminate your employment, effective immediately. Victoria Sterling, you're fired." For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then someone in the back started laughing, a nervous, disbelieving sound. Others joined in, convinced this had to be some kind of elaborate joke. Victoria's father, Harold Sterling, stood up from his wheelchair at the far end of the table. At 64, cancer had carved him down to bone and determination, but his voice still carried the authority of a man who'd built an empire from nothing. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his words cutting through the confused laughter like a blade, "my son-in-law is absolutely correct. I transferred controlling interest of Sterling Industries to David Patterson 5 years ago, upon his legal adoption into our family. The paperwork is on file with our attorneys." The laughter died like someone had pulled a plug. Victoria dropped her trophy. It hit the marble floor with a sound like breaking bones. "Daddy?" Victoria's voice cracked on the word. What are you talking about? This is impossible. This is my company, my birthright. Harold's eyes, still sharp despite his failing body, fixed on his daughter with something that might have been disappointment or might have been disgust. Your birthright was respect, integrity, and loyalty. You've shown me none of those things. Patricia Sterling shot to her feet, her chair scraping against the floor. Harold, what have you done? You can't just give away everything we've built to this nobody. I can, and I did, Harold replied calmly. David has shown me more loyalty in 8 years than either of you have shown in a lifetime. He's earned this company. You've simply assumed you deserved it. Victoria stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the carpet. The golden trophy lay forgotten at her feet, its shine already seeming tarnished under the harsh boardroom lights. This isn't over, she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. She looked around the room at faces that had been friendly moments before, searching for allies who were already calculating their positions in this new reality. Actually, I said, folding the termination letter and placing it on the table in front of her empty chair, it is. Security will escort you out. Your personal items will be boxed and delivered tomorrow. Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. You fool! You planned this. You've been planning this for years. I smiled for the first time all evening, and I let her see every tooth. Actually, I'd been planning to wait until next year, but you know what they say about the best-laid plans? Sometimes opportunity knocks, and sometimes it gets handed a microphone and decides to humiliate people in public. She turned and ran from the room, her heels clicking frantically against the marble. Patricia followed, shooting venomous looks over her shoulder that promised this war was far from over. The boardroom remained silent for a long moment after they left. Finally, Harold wheeled himself over to where I stood. Feel better? He asked quietly. Ask me tomorrow, I replied, when I see what they try to burn down on their way out. Harold chuckled, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. Son, if I know my wife and daughter, tomorrow's going to be very interesting indeed. He was right, of course. But as I looked around the room at the stunned faces of Sterling Industries leadership, I realized I was actually looking forward to it. For the first time in 8 years, I wasn't the one who was going to be surprised. I'd been waiting years to say those words to Victoria. The fact that I finally had the power to back them up, well, that was just the cherry on top of what promised to be a very satisfying Sunday. I should have known Victoria wouldn't go quietly. By the time I got home to my house in Beacon Hill, she'd already begun her campaign of destruction. The security system I'd installed 3 months ago had been worth every penny, because without it, I never would have seen her coming. The cameras caught her arriving at 11:47 p.m., still in her evening gown from the awards dinner, but now accessorized with a tire iron and what appeared to be several cans of spray paint. Patricia was with her, along with Victoria's lover, a detail I'd been saving for a special occasion. But tonight seemed as good as any. His name was Marcus Thornfield, and he was everything I wasn't. Tall, blonde, trust fund handsome, and dumb as a box of rocks. Victoria had been sleeping with him for 18 months, thinking she was being clever about it. She wasn't. When you hire a private investigator to protect your business interests, you tend to learn about all sorts of interesting things. I watched from my study window as they vandalized my car with the enthusiasm of teenagers on a bender. Red paint across the windshield spelling out thief. All 4 tires slashed. The word loser keyed into the driver's side door with artistic flair. My phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. This is just the beginning, you pathetic piece of crap. I'm going to destroy you. I poured myself 3 fingers of Harold's 25-year-old Macallan and settled in to watch the show. They worked for almost an hour, transforming my BMW into a modern art installation about betrayal and rage. When they finished, Victoria stood in my driveway, breathing hard, her designer dress torn at the shoulder, her hair wild around her face. She looked up at my window, and even from 3 stories up, I could see the fury burning in her eyes. She raised her middle finger in a gesture that was both childish and somehow deeply satisfying. At least now I knew exactly where we stood. I raised my whiskey glass and a mock toast and took a sip. The Macallan was smooth as silk and probably cost more than Marcus's monthly allowance from Mommy and Daddy. Life was good. My phone rang, Harold's number. Did you see the news? He asked without preamble. If by news you mean the abstract art installation currently decorating my driveway, then yes. Harold's laugh turned into a coughing fit that lasted nearly a minute. When he recovered, his voice was rougher than usual. Patricia's been calling board members all night, trying to organize some kind of coup. She's claiming I'm not mentally competent to make business decisions. Are you? Competent enough to know my daughter's a vindictive little witch and my wife's a scheming harpy. That's all the competence this situation requires. I watched Victoria and her crew pile into Marcus's ridiculous yellow Lamborghini. The car was a monument to everything wrong with inherited wealth. Loud, flashy, and completely impractical for anything except announcing to the world that you had more money than sense. What do you want me to do about Patricia? I asked. Nothing yet. Let her make her moves. The board won't support her. They're too smart to bet against the majority shareholder. But she'll try to make your life miserable in other ways. More miserable than having my wife screw her boy toy for a year and a half? Oh, you knew about that? Harold, I've known about that since month 2. I know about the apartment Marcus rents for their little encounters. I know about the weekend trips to Martha's Vineyard they think are secret. I know about the pregnancy scare last spring and the very private doctor who took care of it. Silence on the other end of the line. Then, Jesus Christ, David, why didn't you say anything? Because I was waiting for the right moment. Tonight felt like the right moment. And you're not upset, hurt? I considered the question seriously. Was I hurt? Probably. Was I surprised? Not even a little bit. Victoria had married me because Harold liked me, and she thought it would secure her position in the company. I'd married her because she was beautiful, and I was stupid enough to think that might be enough. I'm relieved, I said finally. It makes what comes next a lot easier. What comes next? War, Harold. Your daughter just declared it, and I'm going to give her exactly what she asked for. The next morning brought the first wave of Patricia's counterattack. I woke up to 17 missed calls, 43 text messages, and a voicemail box so full it had stopped accepting new messages. The local news had somehow gotten hold of a story about family drama at Sterling Industries, complete with unnamed sources claiming Harold was suffering from dementia and had been manipulated into signing over his company to an unscrupulous son-in-law. The reporter was a blonde, 20-something with cannery eyes and a smile that suggested she'd sell her grandmother for a ratings boost. She'd positioned herself on the sidewalk outside my house, with my vandalized car prominently displayed in the background. This is Rebecca Chen reporting from Beacon Hill, where questions are swirling around the dramatic boardroom coup that took place last night at Sterling Industries. Sources close to the family suggest that company founder Harold Sterling may have been coerced into transferring control of his multi-million-dollar empire to his son-in-law, David Patterson, a man with no business experience and a questionable background. Questionable background. I had to admire Patricia's efficiency. In less than 12 hours, she'd managed to plant a story that painted me as some kind of fortune-hunting con artist. The fact that I'd been working as Harold's personal assistant for 3 years before marrying Victoria and had an MBA from Wharton apparently didn't make for as compelling television. I called in sick to work, a luxury I could now afford as the owner of the company, and spent the morning returning phone calls from reporters, board members, and business partners who wanted to know if Sterling Industries was about to implode. The conversation with our biggest client, Morrison Construction, was particularly enlightening. Dave, what the hell is going on over there? Jim Morrison's voice carried the kind of stress that came from watching potential profits evaporate in real time. I've got Patricia Sterling on one line telling me you've staged some kind of hostile takeover, and Victoria on another line crying about how her father's lost his mind. Meanwhile, the news is making it sound like your company's about to collapse into chaos. Jim, I need you to listen to me very carefully, I said, settling into Harold's leather chair in the study. Harold Sterling is not suffering from dementia. He's dying of cancer, and he wanted to make sure his company survived him. He chose me as his successor because I'm the only person in his family who actually gives a damn about the business instead of just the money it generates. But Victoria's been too busy screwing her boyfriend to pay attention to what actually keeps this company profitable. When's the last time she returned one of your calls personally instead of having her assistant handle it? Silence. Then, it's been a while? 6 months, I said, consulting the notes I'd been keeping. The last time Victoria Sterling had a direct conversation with you was February 15th, when you called to complain about the Henderson project running 3 weeks behind schedule. She told you it wasn't her problem and hung up on you. How do you know that? Because I'm the one who fixed the Henderson project. I'm the one who's been handling your account for the last year while Victoria collected the credit. I'm the one who negotiated the Miller contract that saved your A when the economy tanked last spring." Another long pause. Jesus, Dave, I had no idea. That was the point. Harold wanted to see who would actually do the work versus who would just take credit for it. The results were illuminating. By noon, I'd had similar conversations with 8 of our 10 biggest clients. The message was consistent. They'd been dealing with me behind the scenes for months, while Victoria played the role of figurehead. The transition of power wasn't going to disrupt their business relationships. It was going to improve them. Patricia's media campaign was already starting to backfire. When reporters called our clients expecting to hear concerns about instability, they instead got testimonials about my competence and dedication. The narrative was shifting from unscrupulous takeover to natural succession. And I could practically feel Patricia's blood pressure rising with each positive interview. Victoria, meanwhile, had moved on to more direct tactics. At 2:15 p.m., she showed up at my office with Marcus in tow and a security guard I didn't recognize. "I'm here to collect my personal belongings," she announced to Jenny, my secretary, in a voice loud enough to carry through the entire floor, "and to make sure my husband hasn't stolen anything that belongs to me." Jenny, bless her heart, didn't even blink. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Patterson, but Mr. Patterson left instructions that you're not authorized to be in the building without an appointment. This is my father's company." "Actually," I said, stepping out of my office, "it's my company, and you're trespassing." Victoria's face flushed red. She was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, the first time I'd seen her dressed down in public in years. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wasn't wearing makeup. She looked younger, more vulnerable, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. Then Marcus opened his mouth. "Look, buddy," he said, puffing out his chest like a peacock showing off her potential mates. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but Victoria's family built this place. You're just some nobody who got lucky." I looked him up and down slowly. Marcus Thornfield was 28 years old, 6'2", and had the kind of artificial tan that came from expensive salons rather than actual sunlight. His clothes probably cost more than most people made in a month, and he wore them with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never had to work for anything in his life. "You're absolutely right," I said finally. "I am a nobody, and just a guy who married into this family and tried to make himself useful. The difference between us, Marcus, is that I actually succeeded." "What's that supposed to mean?" I smiled. "It means your trust fund ran out 6 months ago, and Victoria's been paying your rent ever since. It means the Lamborghini you drove here is registered in her name because your credit's so bad you couldn't finance a bicycle. It means you're not her boyfriend, you're her very expensive pet." Marcus's tan couldn't hide the flush that crept up his neck. "You don't know what you're talking about. I know you defaulted on a business loan last year after your brilliant idea to open a chain of artisanal coffee shops crashed and burned. I know your parents cut you off after the cocaine arrest in Miami. I know Victoria's been supporting you because she thought having a young, handsome boyfriend made her look successful and desirable." Victoria grabbed Marcus' arm. "We're leaving," she said quickly. "Good idea," I replied. "And Marcus, next time you want to call someone a nobody, you might want to make sure you're actually somebody first." They left without another word, Victoria practically dragging Marcus toward the elevator. The security guard they'd brought, probably hired to intimidate me, looked embarrassed as he followed them out. Jenny waited until the elevator doors closed before speaking. "That was brutal." "That was just the opening shot," I said. "It's going to get much worse before it gets better." I was right, of course, but as I watched Victoria's reflection disappear in the polished steel of the elevator doors, I realized I was actually looking forward to finding out just how much worse it could get. After all, I'd been playing defense for 8 years. It was time to see what I could do on offense. The boxing gym smelled like sweat, leather, and broken dreams. It was perfect. Mickey's place sat in the basement of a converted warehouse in South Boston, the kind of neighborhood where gentrification hadn't quite reached yet. The walls were lined with photos of fighters who'd made it big and twice as many who hadn't. The ring in the center had seen more blood than a trauma ward, and the heavy bags hanging from the ceiling had absorbed enough punishment to level a small building. I'd been coming here 3 times a week for the past 2 years, ever since I realized that marrying Victoria meant I'd need an outlet for my frustration that didn't involve booze or homicide. Mickey Torino, the owner, was 73 years old, built like a fire hydrant, and had more street wisdom in his pinky finger than most people accumulated in a lifetime. He was waiting for me when I arrived at 6 p.m., sitting on a folding chair beside the ring, watching two teenagers knock the hell out of each other with the focused attention of a master craftsman. "Saw you on the news," he said without looking at me. "Fancy boy with the fancy wife and the fancy problems." I started wrapping my hands, a ritual that had become as natural as breathing. "You disapprove?" "I disapprove of people who don't fight back when they're getting screwed. You finally grew some balls, so good for you." The teenagers finished their round, and Mickey called them over for a critique that was equal parts technique and life philosophy. While he was busy explaining why leading with your chin was a bad idea both in boxing and in life, I worked the heavy bag, trying to punch away the tension that had been building since the awards dinner. I was halfway through my routine when Victoria and Marcus showed up. They stood in the doorway like tourists who'd taken a wrong turn on their way to the aquarium, clearly out of their element but trying to project confidence. Victoria had changed back into her armor, designer clothes, perfect makeup, jewelry that cost more than most people's cars. Marcus wore a suit that probably came from Milan and shoes that had never touched anything rougher than marble floors. "Well, well," Victoria said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she wanted everyone in the room to know she was slumming. "So this is where my husband comes to play tough guy." The gym went quiet, not completely silent. The rhythmic thump of gloves on bags continued, and someone was still jumping rope in the corner. But the kind of quiet that meant everyone was suddenly very interested in what was about to happen. Mickey looked up from his students and studied my visitors with the same attention he'd give to a suspicious rash. "Help you folks with something?" "We're looking for David," Victoria said, as if the fact that I was standing 10 feet away hitting a heavy bag wasn't obvious to everyone in the room. "You found him," Mickey replied. "Question is, what do you want with him?" Marcus stepped forward, trying to look intimidating in his $1,000 suit. "We need to talk to him about some business matters." "Business matters." Mickey repeated the words like they tasted bad. "In my gym, during training hours." He stood up slowly, all 5'6" of him, radiating the kind of menace that came from 50 years of dealing with people who thought money made them tough. "You see any boardrooms in here, pretty boy? Look, old man." That was as far as Marcus got before Mickey's hand shot out and grabbed him by the tie. For a 73-year-old, Mickey moved like lightning, and suddenly Marcus found himself bent over at an uncomfortable angle, his face inches from Mickey's. "Old man?" Mickey's voice was conversational, almost friendly. "Son, I've been breaking jaws since before you were born. The only reason yours is still attached to your face is because I like David, and I figure he might want the pleasure of rearranging your features himself." Marcus's face was turning an interesting shade of purple, partly from the tight cutting off his air supply and partly from embarrassment. Victoria started to say something, but Mickey held up his free hand. "Ma'am, I'm going to give you some free advice. This is a place where people come to work out their problems with their fists instead of their lawyers. Your husband's been coming here for 2 years, and he's gotten pretty good at it. Your boyfriend here looks like he's never been in a real fight in his life. You do the math." Mickey released Marcus, who stumbled backward, loosening his tie and trying to regain what was left of his dignity. Victoria's face had gone white, then red, then white again. "This is ridiculous," she said. "David, we need to talk. Privately." I stopped hitting the bag and turned to face them, pulling off my gloves. "We don't have anything to talk about, Victoria. You made that pretty clear last night when you decided to redecorate my car." I was upset. You humiliated me in front of everyone. I fired you for cause. There's a difference." Marcus had recovered enough to try asserting himself again. "Look, man, I don't know what your problem is, but Victoria's trying to be reasonable here." I looked at him for a long moment, then walked over to where Mickey kept his equipment. I selected a pair of 16-ounce gloves and held them out to Marcus. "You want to discuss this? Let's discuss it properly." Marcus stared at the gloves like I was offering him a live snake. "I'm not going to fight you." "Why not? You came to my gym. You insulted my friend. You're sleeping with my wife. Seems like we've got plenty to settle." "I don't fight people who are beneath me." The gym went completely silent this time. Even the jump rope stopped. Mickey made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a growl. "Beneath you?" I repeated. "That's interesting, because from where I'm standing, you look like a trust fund baby who's never worked a day in his life, never earned anything on his own, and is currently living off the charity of a woman who's about to lose everything she thought she owned." Marcus's face flushed again. You don't know anything about me. I know you're a coward. I know you talk tough when you think you're safe, but the moment someone offers you a fair fight, you fold like a cheap suit. I tossed the gloves at his feet. Prove me wrong. For a moment, I thought he might actually do it. His hands clenched into fists, and he took a half step toward the gloves. Then he looked around the gym, saw the faces watching him, and realized that everyone in the room could see exactly what he was. This is stupid, he muttered. Victoria, let's go. Smart choice, I said. Running away is probably your best option. Victoria started to follow Marcus toward the door, then stopped and turned back to me. You think you've won something, but you haven't. This isn't over. You're right, I agreed. It's not over. It's barely started. But when it is over, you're going to wish you'd taken Harold's money and disappeared quietly instead of trying to fight me. She left without another word, her heels clicking against the concrete floor like a countdown timer. Marcus slunk out behind her, and I could hear him complaining about crazy people and dangerous neighborhoods as they climbed the stairs to street level. Mickey waited until he was sure they were gone before speaking. Friend of yours is a real piece of work. Ex-wife, actually, as of yesterday. And the boyfriend? Trust fund baby with delusions of adequacy. Mickey nodded like this explained everything. They'll be back. Her type always comes back. They can't stand losing, especially to someone they think is beneath them. I'm counting on it. You got a plan? I smiled and picked up my gloves. I'm working on it. The plan, such as it was, started with a phone call to my lawyer the next morning. Janet Morrison, no relation to Jim Morrison from Morrison Construction, was a Harvard-educated shark who specialized in family law and had a reputation for eating opposing counsel live. David, congratulations on your promotion, she said when I walked into her downtown office. I have to admit, I didn't see that coming. Neither did Victoria. That's why we need to talk. Janet poured coffee from an expensive-looking machine and settled behind her desk. At 55, she had silver hair, sharp eyes, and the kind of smile that made opposing lawyers consider career changes. Let me guess. She's not taking the divorce well. She's not taking anything well. Last night, she vandalized my car. This morning, she tried to have me declared mentally incompetent. This afternoon, she's probably planning to burn down the house. Any evidence of the vandalism? I pulled out my phone and showed her the security footage. Janet watched Victoria, Marcus, and Patricia destroy my BMW with the focused attention of a scientist studying a particularly interesting specimen. Well, that's straightforward enough. What about assets? That's where it gets complicated. I handed her a folder containing copies of Harold's will, the adoption papers, and the corporate documents transferring ownership of Sterling Industries. Harold made me his heir, 5 years ago. But Victoria doesn't know the full extent of what that means. Janet spent 20 minutes reading through the documents, occasionally making notes or asking for clarification. When she finished, she sat back in her chair and whistled softly. David, do you understand what you're sitting on here? A controlling interest in a mid-sized construction company? Try again. Sterling Industries isn't just construction. According to these documents, Harold's been quietly acquiring real estate, technology patents, and investment portfolios for the past 15 years. The construction business is maybe 30% of the total assets. She pulled out a calculator and started running numbers. Conservative estimate? You're worth somewhere north of $50 million. I nearly choked on my coffee. 50 million? Maybe more. Harold's been very clever about hiding assets in subsidiary companies and investment vehicles. Your wife has no idea how rich her family actually is. Was how rich her family was. Right, because according to these documents, it's all yours now. The house, the business, the investments, even the art collection. Harold left Victoria a trust fund with about $2 million, and that's only if she meets certain conditions. What conditions? Janet flipped to the back of the will. She has to remain married to you and demonstrate appropriate behavior befitting a member of the Sterling family. If she divorces you or engages in conduct that brings shame to the family name, the trust fund goes to charity. I stared at her. You're telling me that if Victoria divorces me, she gets nothing? Nothing except what she's managed to save from her salary, which, according to her tax returns, isn't much. Your wife has expensive tastes and no concept of budgeting. And if I divorce her? Same result. Harold was very specific about wanting to keep the family together. If the marriage ends for any reason, Victoria loses her inheritance. I sat back in my chair trying to process this information. Harold had been playing a much longer game than I'd realized. He hadn't just made me his heir, he'd created a situation where Victoria would destroy herself if she tried to destroy me. There's one more thing, Janet said. The adoption papers include a clause that makes you Harold's legal son in all respects. If Victoria tries to contest the will, she'd essentially be arguing that her father wasn't competent to choose his own heir. That's a very difficult case to make, especially with Harold still alive, to testify to his mental state. So what do you recommend? Janet's smile was pure hunter. Let her make the first move. Document everything she does. Build a case for inappropriate behavior that violates the terms of her trust fund. Then, when she's destroyed her own position, offer her a settlement that gets her out of your life permanently. How long will that take? With Victoria's temperament? Not long. She's already started with the vandalism and the media campaign. Give her enough rope, and she'll hang herself. I left Janet's office feeling like I was seeing the world clearly for the first time in years. Harold hadn't just given me a company. He'd given me the tools to win a war I didn't even know I was fighting. Victoria wanted to play games? Fine. But she was about to learn that some games have consequences she couldn't imagine, and I was very much looking forward to teaching her the rules. The first sign that Victoria was escalating came at 3 a.m. on Thursday morning, when my phone started ringing with calls from reporters asking for comment on the explosive allegations that had just surfaced about my past. By dawn, the story was everywhere. Sterling Industries' heir has criminal past. Company takeover linked to fraud allegations. Family sources reveal pattern of deception. The articles were masterpieces of innuendo and selective editing. They took the fact that I'd grown up in foster care and spun it into a narrative about a troubled youth with authority issues. They mentioned that I'd been arrested twice in college, once for a bar fight that wasn't my fault, and once for a protest that got out of hand, and made it sound like I had a criminal record. They even managed to make my MBA from Wharton sound suspicious, suggesting I'd somehow conned my way into the program. The most creative touch was the anonymous family source, who claimed I'd been physically abusive to Victoria and had threatened Harold into signing over the company. The source, obviously Patricia, painted a picture of a manipulative sociopath who'd infiltrated the Sterling family with the specific goal of stealing their fortune. It was brilliant, vicious, and almost certainly actionable. It was also a mistake. I called Janet at 6 a.m. Did you see the news? I'm reading it now. This is good for us, David. Good? They're calling me a criminal. They're making specific, false, and damaging claims about you in print and on television. That's textbook defamation. More importantly, they're doing it in a way that's clearly coordinated and malicious. This isn't just bad publicity. It's a conspiracy to destroy your reputation for financial gain. So what do? We document everything and then we destroy them in court. But first, we need to control the narrative. Janet had already scheduled a press conference for that afternoon. By noon, she'd assembled a response package that included my college transcripts, employment records, character references from Harold's doctors confirming his mental competence, and security footage from my house showing Victoria vandalizing my car. The press conference was held in the lobby of Sterling Industries, with me standing behind a podium flanked by company logos and Janet looking like a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, reading from prepared remarks that Janet had crafted with surgical precision. I'm here to address the false and malicious allegations that have been made against me in the past 24 hours. I went through each claim methodically, providing documentation that refuted every allegation. The criminal past became a college bar fight where I defended a female friend from an aggressive drunk. The fraud allegations evaporated when confronted with my actual academic and employment records. The claims about threatening Harold were demolished by testimony from his doctors and nurses, who described our relationship as loving and respectful. Then came the counterattack. I want to be clear about what's really happening here, I said, looking directly into the cameras. My estranged wife, Victoria Sterling Patterson, is angry that her father chose to leave his company to someone who actually worked to build it rather than someone who simply expected to inherit it. Rather than accept this decision with grace, she has chosen to wage a campaign of maltreatment, vandalism, and defamation. I nodded to Janet, who activated a large screen behind me. The security footage of Victoria destroying my car played in high definition, showing her face clearly as she swung the tire iron and sprayed paint across my windshield. This footage was taken 2 nights ago, shortly after Mrs. Patterson was terminated from her position at Sterling Industries for cause. As you can see, her response to losing her job was not to seek legal recourse or attempt to resolve our differences through proper channels, but to commit acts of vandalism and destruction. The reporters were scribbling notes furiously. This was the kind of story they lived for. Rich people behaving badly, caught on camera, with legal and financial consequences hanging in the balance. Furthermore, I continued, I have reason to believe that Mrs. Patterson has been embezzling company funds to support an extramarital affair with Marcus Thornfield, a failed entrepreneur whose business ventures she has been financing without board approval or proper documentation. That got their attention. Nothing sold newspapers like a Zex scandal with financial impropriety thrown in. I have documentation showing that over the past 18 months, Mrs. Patterson has written company checks totaling more than $200,000 to Mr. Thornfield and various businesses associated with him, claiming these were legitimate consulting fees. However, Mr. Thornfield has performed no consulting work for Sterling Industries, and these payments appear to be personal gifts disguised as business expenses. This was technically true, though I was stretching the definition of embezzlement. Victoria had been authorized to approve consulting contracts up to $50,000 without board oversight, and she'd used that authority to funnel money to Marcus through a series of shell companies he'd created. It was unethical and probably stupid, but proving it was criminal would be difficult. But I wasn't trying to send her to prison. I was trying to destroy her credibility, and for that purpose, the appearance of impropriety was just as effective as actual criminal behavior. The press conference ran for 45 minutes, with reporters asking increasingly hostile questions about Victoria's behavior and increasingly softball questions about my qualifications to run Sterling Industries. By the time it was over, the narrative had completely flipped. Victoria had gone from wronged daughter to vindictive ex-wife, and I'd gone from suspicious interloper to competent businessman defending himself against false accusations. The afternoon news cycles led with stories about embezzlement allegations rock Sterling Industries, and security footage shows vandalism by fired executive. The morning's character assassination had become the afternoon's cautionary tale about what happened when privilege met consequences. Victoria's response was swift and predictable. At 6 p.m., she showed up at my house with Marcus, Patricia, and what appeared to be a moving truck. I watched from my study window as they argued with the security guards I'd hired after the vandalism incident. Victoria was waving papers and pointing at the house, while Patricia stood behind her, like a general directing troops. Marcus mostly just looked uncomfortable, which suggested he was finally starting to understand the magnitude of the crap storm he'd wandered into. After 20 minutes of heated discussion, one of the security guards came to the front door. "Mr. Patterson, the lady says she has a court order allowing her to remove her personal property from the house." I came downstairs and examined the papers Victoria was waving around. They were legitimate, a temporary restraining order that allowed her to collect her belongings under police supervision. Janet had warned me this was coming. "Fine," I said, "but I want everything documented. Photos of what she takes, receipts, witnesses, and nothing leaves this house that isn't clearly her personal property." What followed was 3 hours of the most passive-aggressive moving experience in human history. Victoria went through the house like a tornado, claiming ownership of everything from furniture we'd bought together to artwork that had belonged to Harold's family for generations. I followed behind her with a video camera, documenting every item, and occasionally pointing out that certain pieces had been in the house long before she'd lived there. The breaking point came when she tried to take Harold's collection of first edition books. "Those belong to my father," she said, directing the movers to start boxing them up. "Those belong to Harold's estate," I corrected, "which means they belong to me. They're family heirlooms. You're not family anymore. You're an ex-employee with a restraining order." Victoria's face went through several interesting color changes. "You can't just steal my inheritance. I'm not stealing anything. I'm preventing you from stealing things that were never yours to begin with." Patricia stepped forward, her jewelry catching the light like armor. "Young man, I don't know who you think you are, but I know exactly who I am," I interrupted. "I'm the legal owner of this house and everything in it. I'm the majority shareholder of Sterling Industries. I'm Harold Sterling's adopted son and chosen heir. The question is, do you know who you are?" "I'm Harold's wife. You're Harold's soon-to-be ex-wife. He filed for divorce this morning, citing irreconcilable differences and inappropriate conduct. Something about a coordinated campaign to defame his chosen successor. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Patricia's face went white, then red, then white again. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Check with your lawyer," I suggested. "I'm sure Harold's attorney has already been in touch." Victoria looked like she'd been slapped. Daddy's divorcing mother? Apparently, he doesn't appreciate having his mental competence questioned in public, or having his business decisions undermined by family members who think they know better than he does. Marcus, who had been smart enough to stay quiet during most of this exchange, finally spoke up. "This is insane. You can't just destroy people's lives because you're having a temper tantrum." I looked at him with genuine curiosity. "Is that what you think this is? A temper tantrum?" "What else would you call it?" "Justice," I said simply. "You people have spent years treating me like I was some kind of charity case who should be grateful for whatever scraps you threw my way. You've lied, cheated, stolen, and schemed, all while acting like you were entitled to everything you wanted simply because you were born into the right family." I gestured around the house, with its expensive furniture and priceless artwork. "This isn't your birthright. It's not something you deserve just for existing. It's something Harold built through decades of hard work, and he chose to leave it to someone who would continue that work rather than just spend the profits." "You're not better than us," Victoria said, her voice shaking with rage. "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "I'm not better than you, but I'm smarter than you, I work harder than you, and I understand something you've never learned. Actions have consequences." They finished packing Victoria's actual personal belongings, clothes, jewelry, photos, and a few pieces of furniture that were clearly hers, and loaded them into the truck. As they prepared to leave, Victoria turned back to me one last time. "This isn't over," she said. "You keep saying that," I replied. "But every time you try to escalate, you just make things worse for yourself. Maybe it's time to cut your losses and walk away." "Never." I watched the truck disappear down the street, carrying Victoria toward whatever new hell she was planning to create for herself. Patricia rode in the passenger seat of Marcus's Lamborghini, probably already plotting her next move. Marcus looked like he was starting to regret every decision that had led him to this moment. As for me, I poured myself another glass of Harold's Macallan and settled into his favorite chair to wait for whatever came next. Because Victoria was right about one thing, this wasn't over. But she was wrong about who was going to win. Harold died on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 weeks after filing for divorce from Patricia, and 6 weeks after the press conference that had turned Victoria from sympathetic sufferer into public pariah. I was with him at the end, holding his hand in the private room at Massachusetts General Hospital while machines beeped softly around us. The cancer had moved fast in his final weeks, as if it had been waiting for him to finish his business before claiming its prize. "You did good, son," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the oxygen machine. "Better than I hoped." "I learned from the best," I replied. He managed a smile. "Take care of the company, take care of yourself, and don't let the fools grind you down." Those were his last words. Harold Sterling, who had built an empire from nothing and had the wisdom to leave it to someone who would preserve rather than squander it, died at 11:47 a.m. on October 15th, with his chosen heir by his side. Victoria arrived 20 minutes later, having been notified by the hospital staff. She burst into the room still wearing her designer workout clothes, her face streaked with tears and makeup, looking more disheveled than I'd ever seen her. "Daddy?" She rushed to the bed, but Harold was already gone, his face peaceful in a way it hadn't been for months. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. He went peacefully. Victoria whirled on me, her grief instantly transforming into rage. "You! This is your fault. You stressed him to death with your schemes and your lawsuits and your—" "Victoria!" My voice cut through her hysteria like a blade. He was dying anyway. The cancer was terminal. We both knew that. But you made his last months miserable. You turned him against his own family. I didn't have to turn him against anyone. You did that all by yourself." She collapsed into the chair beside Harold's bed, sobbing with the kind of raw, desperate grief that comes from realizing you've lost something irreplaceable. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her, almost. Then I remembered the vandalism, the media campaign, the embezzlement, the affair, and the 18 months of lies and betrayal that had led us to this point. "The funeral is Thursday," I said. I'll make sure you're notified of the arrangements. I should be planning the funeral. I'm his daughter. You're his estranged daughter who's been publicly questioning his mental competence for the past 2 months. I'm his legal heir and the executor of his estate. I'll be planning the funeral. Victoria looked up at me with eyes that were red from crying and blazing with hatred. You think you've won, don't you? I think Harold got what he wanted. A son who would honor his legacy instead of just spending his money. This isn't over. I was getting tired of hearing that phrase. Victoria, it's been over for weeks. You just haven't accepted it yet. The funeral was held at Trinity Church in Copley Square, with a reception afterward at the Four Seasons. Harold had been specific about wanting a celebration of his life, rather than a mournful dirge. So I arranged for his favorite jazz quartet to play and made sure the bar was stocked with the 25-year-old Macallan he'd loved so much. 300 people attended, including business partners, employees, competitors, and politicians. Harold had been respected in Boston's business community, and his death marked the end of an era. Victoria sat in the front row with Patricia, both of them dressed in black and looking appropriately grief-stricken. Marcus sat beside Victoria, uncomfortable in his funeral suit and clearly wishing he were anywhere else. They'd been staying at Patricia's apartment since the divorce proceedings had forced her to move out of the family mansion. I gave the eulogy, speaking about Harold's vision, his integrity, and his commitment to building something that would last beyond his own lifetime. I talked about his generosity, his wisdom, and his ability to see potential in people others might overlook. Harold Sterling believed that a man's worth wasn't measured by what he inherited, but by what he built, I said, looking out over the packed church. He believed that success without character was just another form of failure. He believed that the greatest gift you could give someone wasn't money or position, but the opportunity to prove themselves worthy of both. I could see Victoria crying in the front row. Whether from grief or rage, I couldn't tell. Patricia sat beside her like a statue, her face carved from ice and malice. Harold chose to entrust his life's work to someone who shared his values and his vision for the future. That trust is not something I take lightly, and it's not something I'll ever betray. Sterling Industries will continue to grow, to innovate, and to provide opportunities for people who are willing to work for them. The reception afterward was a more relaxed affair, with people sharing stories about Harold's generosity, his terrible golf game, and his legendary poker nights. I worked the room like a politician, shaking hands, accepting condolences, and reassuring business partners that Sterling Industries would continue to operate with the same integrity Harold had demanded. Victoria and Patricia held court near the bar, surrounded by a small group of sympathizers who murmured appropriate words about family loyalty and the importance of blood ties. Marcus stood slightly apart from them, nursing a whiskey and looking like he was calculating his exit strategy. The confrontation I'd been expecting finally came during the third hour of the reception. Victoria approached me while I was talking to Jim Morrison about a new project in Cambridge. David, we need to talk, she said, her voice carrying that familiar edge that meant she was about to make demands she had no right to make. I'm sorry, Victoria, but I'm busy right now. Perhaps we could schedule something through my attorney. This is about Daddy's will. There are some irregularities that need to be addressed. Jim Morrison, sensing drama, excused himself and disappeared toward the buffet table. Victoria moved closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more threatening than shouting would have been. I know what you did, she said. I know you manipulated a sick old man into changing his will. I know you forged documents and coerced him into signing things he didn't understand. That's a serious accusation, Victoria. I hope you have evidence to support it. I have lawyers, good lawyers, and they're going to tear apart every document you think protects you. I smiled. Your lawyers are welcome to examine any documents they'd like. Harold's attorney has copies of everything, along with video recordings of Harold signing his will and adoption papers. He was very thorough about documenting his mental state and his reasons for his decisions. Victoria's face went pale. Video recordings? Harold was a careful man. He knew that his decisions might be challenged, so he made sure there would be no question about his competence or his intentions. I leaned closer, lowering my voice to match hers. The recordings are quite detailed. He explains exactly why he chose to leave his estate to me rather than to you. His reasons are unflattering. You're lying. Ask your lawyers to request discovery. They'll find the recordings very enlightening." Victoria stepped back, her confidence visibly shaken. She'd been counting on being able to claim that Harold was incompetent or coerced, but video evidence of him clearly explaining his decisions would destroy that strategy. "This isn't over," she said, but the words lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," I replied. "Harold made his choice. The law supports that choice. You can spend your remaining money fighting it, but you'll lose and you'll end up with nothing instead of the trust fund Harold left you." "What trust fund?" I smiled. "The $2 million he set aside for you, conditional on your behavior. Your lawyers should have explained the terms by now." Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "What terms?" "You get the money if you accept the will without challenge and agree to cease all maltreatment of me and Sterling Industries. If you contest the will or continue your campaign of defamation, the money goes to charity." That's extortion. That's Harold giving you one last chance to walk away with something instead of nothing. I'd recommend you take it." Victoria looked around the reception, perhaps seeing it clearly for the first time. The people who had been sympathetic earlier were now keeping their distance. The business community had already accepted me as Harold's legitimate successor. Her own mother was deep in conversation with a lawyer, probably discussing her own financial situation now that her divorce was final. $2 million, Victoria said quietly. $2 million and the chance to start over somewhere else, maybe California. I hear the weather's nice there. And if I don't take it, then you'll spend the next 2 years fighting a battle you can't win, and you'll end up broke, alone and unemployed. Your choice." Victoria walked away without another word. I watched her collect Patricia and Marcus and leave the reception early, their small group looking diminished and defeated among the crowd of Harold's genuine mourners. 3 days later, Janet called to tell me that Victoria had accepted the terms of the trust fund and signed an agreement not to contest Harold's will. She and Marcus had booked flights to Los Angeles, where she apparently had friends who might help her start a new life. Patricia, meanwhile, had moved to Florida, using her divorce settlement to buy a condo in Miami, where she could spend her remaining years complaining about ungrateful children and the decline of family values. I never saw any of them again. 6 months later, Sterling Industries posted its best quarterly profits in company history. We'd landed 3 major contracts, expanded into renewable energy development, and acquired 2 smaller competitors who'd been struggling in the post-recession economy. I was working late in Harold's old office, my office now, when Jenny buzzed me on the intercom. "Mr. Patterson, there's someone here to see you. Says he's an old friend." Mickey Torino walked in wearing a suit that looked like it had been pressed for the first time since the Carter administration. He looked around the office with the same careful attention he brought to everything, taking in the awards on the walls, the expensive furniture, and the view of Boston Harbor. "Nice place," he said finally. "Very fancy." "That serves its purpose. What brings you downtown, Mickey? Wanted to see how you were doing. Haven't seen you at the gym much lately." "I've been busy, building an empire, settling legal disputes, that sort of thing." Mickey sat down in the chair across from my desk and studied me with those sharp old eyes. "You look different, older, harder. It's been an interesting year." "I bet. Saw in the paper that your wife moved to California." "Ex-wife, and yes, she did. Good riddance, I'd say. She was poison. Boyfriend, too." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the sun set over the harbor. Finally, Mickey spoke again. "You know, I've been thinking about what happened that night they came to the gym, when you offered to fight that pretty boy. What about it? He was scared, not just of getting hurt, but of finding out what he really was when the gloves came off. Some people spend their whole lives avoiding that moment. And some people spend their whole lives waiting for it." Mickey smiled. "You waited a long time for your moment, didn't you? 8 years. Was it worth it?" I looked around the office that had once belonged to Harold, then to his father before him, and now belonged to me. I thought about Victoria, probably sitting in some California coffee shop, trying to figure out how to rebuild a life she'd never actually built in the first place. I thought about Marcus, who was probably already looking for his next wealthy girlfriend to support his lifestyle. I thought about Patricia growing old and bitter in her Florida condo. Then I thought about Harold, who had trusted me with everything he'd worked for, and who had died knowing his legacy was in good hands. Ask me in another 8 years, I said. Mickey laughed and stood up to leave. Fair enough, but don't forget where you came from, son. Success can be just as dangerous as failure if you're not careful. I'll remember. After he left, I stayed in the office until well past midnight, working on plans for Sterling Industries' expansion into the European market. Outside, Boston glittered like a circuit board. All lights and possibilities and endless potential. I had started this story as David Patterson, the nobody who had married above his station and tried to make the best of it. I was ending it as David Sterling, heir to an empire, and architect of my own destiny. Victoria had been wrong about one thing. I wasn't the villain of this story. I was just the guy who'd finally learned to fight back, and I was very good at it.